Hello, I'm Brian Bruce and welcome to Head to Head. My guest today is Grace Blakeley, who's a leading political economist in the United Kingdom. She's a staff writer for the Tribune and author of several books, including this one, Vulture, Capitalism. Where are you? There we are. Vulture, Capitalism, Corporate Crimes, Backdoor Bailouts and the Death of Freedom, which is what I'm particularly interested in talking to you today about. Grace, welcome to the program at the beginning of your day and the close of mine.
Thanks so much for having me, Brian. It's really great to be here to chat with you.
Now, tell me, just to set the scene, how would you describe where you are personally on the political and economic spectrum?
Well, I describe myself as a socialist, proudly. So I suppose that puts me towards the far left of the political and economic spectrum. I would say I'm a kind of democratic socialist in the tradition of people like, for example, Tony Benn, who's someone who I see as a real kind of political idol of mine. Yeah.
Are you going to avoid the Marxist word, or are we allowed to say that?
Oh, well, in terms of my political philosophy, I am very much a Marxist. I see that, though, less as a kind of political persuasion and more of an intellectual framework, a way of kind of analysing the world and analysing capitalism. You could be a Marxist, you could be a Keynesian, you could be a Ricardian. These are kind of intellectual frameworks that you can use to analyze society and the economy. And from that perspective, then yes, I'm definitely very much a Marxist.
Okay, so look, first of all, I really loved your book. It was for lots of reasons, incredibly well written, provoking and challenging, but also that it was written by someone who was, for me, a young person. I mean, you weren't even born when neoliberalism came into New Zealand and in 1984. And you understand this economic theory and how it destroyed our society that I lived through, and I'm still living through it, and I'm still fighting it because it's made an enormous mess to our society, particularly in the lives of children. One in every 5 of our children today is not assured this week of good food on the table and will sometimes go hungry. Now, in a country that produces, enough food to feed 40 million people, not 5 million people each year, I think that's disgraceful. But let's move on. I want to begin really with the idea that you challenge in your book, that we can only have either free market economy or a state-controlled one. Do you want to take me just briefly through that?
Yeah, well, this was very much the reason that I wrote this book. I think it was kind of catalyzed by some experiences that I had at the start of the pandemic, actually. So we just had the 2019 election in the UK. I'd been campaigning for Jeremy Corbyn. Then the pandemic hit all of a sudden. Corbyn lost the election and we went into this kind of crisis mode where everyone was obviously on lockdown. And I started doing a few interviews on TV. And there were some, breakfast TV presenters who were talking to me about the news of the day. And I kept getting asked a question along the lines of, oh, well, the government's spending lots of money now and intervening in the economy. Doesn't that mean that Jeremy Corbyn basically won the election anyway and we got socialism? And it struck me that there was just this real deep-seated misunderstanding as to what socialism is and relatedly what capitalism is. If people could say that the government spending money to bail out large corporations was socialism, or indeed, the bailout of the banks in 2008, for example, that involved an expansion in the size of the state, but it certainly didn't challenge the fundamental imbalance of power between workers and bosses and, their allies in the state that characterizes capitalism. That fundamental divide between elites and everyone else, basically, is what makes capitalism capitalism. And even when you have a larger state doing more stuff in the economy, that doesn't necessarily challenge that divide. So I just really wanted to put forward this argument, which is a kind of Marxist argument, a Marxist understanding. It's very funny that people often equate those on the left with saying we need a really big state, when Marx said the capitalist state is nothing but a committee for managing the affairs of the bourgeoisie. He was very distrustful of the capitalist state. So I kind of wanted to almost like modernize that argument and show how the left has been dragged almost down this kind of cul-de-sac of saying, that every time the state spends more money, that is necessarily good for socialism, or that's going to be good for workers. And I think we're seeing that today with Europe now saying they want to have a massive rearmament program, spend loads of money on weapons. That's not going to be good for anyone, certainly not working people. They say it will create jobs, but it won't create very many jobs because it's all generally kind of capital rather than labor intensive spending. And it's going to potentially escalate this conflict and divert resources away from things that we actually need. So, yeah, it was really about the idea of challenging this assumption that, lefties want a big state and those on the right want a small state, because those on the right don't want a small state. They want a state that does the things that they want it to do, like bail out the banks and like jail climate protesters and clamp down on unions. And that's really what the book is all about. It says capitalism is this kind of oligarchic system. It's not a free market.
Well, we've got a very right-wing government in New Zealand at the moment, a right-wing coalition government that's doing all those things that right-wing governments do, austerity, all of that sort of stuff. But what you see really is a collusion between the state and the people who want to make money out of it, Is that my understanding from your book?
Absolutely. Yeah, that is exactly what I talk about. And the real message is that collusion between vested interests in the public and private sectors, so between large, powerful corporations and financial institutions on the one hand, and then politicians, bureaucrats, etc. on the other hand, that isn't a kind of, subversion of capitalism. That is the way that capitalism works. Because there are a lot of people who would say, oh, that's crony capitalism. That's not a real free market. And my argument in the book is if you go back throughout the history of capitalism, there's always been this deep cooperation between governments and businesses to basically augment and expand their own power. And the greatest example of this from the very origins of the capitalist system is the East India Company, which was this joint venture between the British state and a bunch of merchants to basically go and colonize India. This is a perfect example of how the public and private sector work together, basically in the interests of imperialism.
Yeah, I saw that in your book, and you also talk about Boeing in your book. Yeah. Vulture capitalism. What does dove capitalism look like?
That's actually a very good challenge. And you know what? I'm going to come up with an argument on the spot because it's not something that I'd ever been asked before. But,
yay!
Well done, actually. It's very rare that I get asked a question that I haven't been asked before. I suppose, there are kind of less extractive forms of capitalism that we've had throughout history. And generally speaking, those forms of capitalism have been the ones in which workers have had more power and civil society groups have had more power. Basically, where the balance of power between the rich and the political class on the one hand, and then the rest of society on the other hand, hasn't been so skewed in favor of the former. So workers have been able to organize to demand higher wages. Protest groups have been able to demand changes to policy. You've had powerful social movements, community movements, etc. In the UK, this was the case in the period following the Second World War for about 30 or 40 years. It was the same across much of Europe. In France, they call it les 30 glorieuses, the 30 glorious years. And I know that it's similar in kind of the US and many other countries. I'm not sure if you had a similar sort of period.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
I grew up in egalitarian New Zealand. Where there wasn't much of a gap between the rich and the poor, that everybody went to state schools, and my mother was a factory worker, my dad was postman, and I sat next to kids whose fathers and mothers were lawyers and in professional class, and it was a very egalitarian society, and I got a free education up to and including university, and I was never hungry, and the state controlled the housing and land and all of those things. It was a society of less choice, less consumer choice. If you wanted a phone, it would be black, and it would take 6 or 8 weeks for the post office to decide that they were going to bring you your black phone, and then it would be a celebration in the family that, yay, we've got a phone. And there was less choice, but because we were at the other end of, well, we're as far away from you as we could possibly go before we start coming back. We were much more self-sufficient. We we fixed things. We were a more sustainable economy. Since globalization and neoliberalism and all of that, we don't grow enough wheat to make our own bread now. We have to import the wheat from Australia and the Ukraine because our farmers have decided that they can make much more money by putting cows and sheep, well, mostly cows actually, onto the land we once grew wheat. But I'm wondering whether anything of this resonates with you in terms of what kind of society would you like to see and how do we get there?
Yeah, so I guess, the thing I would say about this whole era of dubbed capitalism, a kind of more equal form of capitalism, is that it wasn't sustainable. And the reason that it wasn't sustainable is that as long as you have powerful people who own all the things that we need to survive and who are able to organize to get politicians to do what they want, they're going to use that power to try and basically grow their wealth and power at the expense of everyone else. And that was exactly what we saw. There was a kind of coordinated group of business leaders, financiers, working with political leaders under this framework of neoliberalism, who made it their mission to basically deconstruct that relatively short period of equality and prosperity that we had in, all over the world after the Second World War, and replace it with the system that we have today, which is neoliberalism. It's the system that we've had since the 1980s, a much longer period of rising inequality and, as you were saying, kind of globalization, financialization, a much less sustainable economy, a much more unequal economy, but one that deeply benefits the rich and, and powerful elites. So that's the problem with, retaining capitalism, right? As opposed to moving beyond capitalism towards a different kind of system. I'm not saying that there aren't better or worse types of capitalism, because I do believe that there are. The issue is that unless you actually move beyond that system, there's always going to be this pressure to come back to this fundamental driving force, which is just maximize returns, generate as much profit as possible. So that's why I argue in the book, we need to move beyond capitalism and actually build democratic socialist economies. And for me, that looks like a deepening of democracy and an expansion of democracy into the economy, right? And so, what you were saying about, how the drawbacks of the kind of post-war settlement, I think are really important. Those questions around choice, around freedom. It's part of why the neoliberal politicians won, because people were they felt chafed against the constraints that had been placed upon them under that system, which is why I think it is really important to conceptualize the kind of system that we would want in terms of these ideas around freedom. And that's really what I do in the book. I say, actually, in a capitalist society, the freedom for the vast majority of people is extremely limited. And this is even more true, I would say, now under neoliberalism than it was under the social democratic settlement, because yes, you have some consumer choice, but realistically, when you go to the supermarket, you're choosing between a few brands that are all produced by the same companies because it's a monopolistic economy. And you don't have very much choice around basically any other area of your life. You're kind of trapped and constrained and disempowered. So, building a system that really respected human dignity and freedom would require moving beyond that.
Talk about the death of freedom. How has freedom died in the current economic system that we live under?
So the view of freedom that I put forward is one that moves beyond this kind of narrow understanding of individual choice and says you have to be free to make your own decisions, but that isn't enough, because the decisions that you're choosing from within any particular moment have already been made for you by someone else. It's like you can go to the shops and you can choose between an array of products, but you didn't get to decide what products were on the shelves. You didn't get to decide whether or not people were paid fair wages to produce those products. You don't get to decide whether or not there's poisonous chemicals in the products. You don't get to decide, whether or not the production of those products is actually devastating the climate, making your life much harder in the future. So all of these decisions have been made somewhere else by someone else out of sight. And the real coup of neoliberalism was to tell us, well, you get to make this one final choice about what you buy on the shelves, and that makes you free. And of course, it's absurd because, you're not free in that choice scenario. And in so many other areas of your life, exactly. In so many other areas of your life, your freedom is also heavily limited by what you can afford, by, the kinds of jobs that are available to you. Our freedom is extremely limited by the fact that we have this kind of oligarchic, democratic in inverted commas system that's really controlled by a small number of powerful billionaires and their allies and lobbyists. So the view of freedom that I put forward is, I say it's a Marxist view of freedom in the sense that it's rooted in the idea that it's not enough just to have that one choice to go into the shops and say, I want this or I want that. Real freedom is about being able to have a say about all of the conditions that affect your life, having a say over the institutions that govern you, having a say in the economy, in your community, really having a kind of truly democratic society.
Wasn't it ever so that there are elites in society and you don't get total freedom because the elites control whatever, your life? And it's a question of what kind of elite you want ruling you. And when we had an egalitarian New Zealand, it was the unions who were the elites. You wouldn't get a job if you weren't part of the union, and the unions are very powerful. And we've got two major islands, and there's ferries that go across. And every Christmas there would be a strike, because the cooks and stewards union would go on strike, and then they would get higher wages and all of that. And so, isn't there an issue to do with how elites are controlled in a democratic socialist society?
So my vision of democratic socialism involves a very different view of what elite power looks like. And I don't think it's true to say that it's inevitable that you will always have a small number of people who are able to basically control the whole of society. I think that's true. And equally, I don't think the unions were ever really in that position. If you look at, relatively speaking, the power of those unions, it was very visible to you as a consumer, the power of those unions. But equally, going on behind the scenes, who was setting the wages, who was setting, the levels of investment, who was setting interest rates?
Yeah,
it was someone else.
The government. We had we had an arbitration court that set how much carpenters would get, how much bakers would get, how much postmen would get, So it was the government that controlled. The next question is, who controlled the government,
Yeah, exactly. That's kind of what I'm saying, right? So in a democratic economy, then you don't have unaccountable elites making decisions on behalf of everyone else. You have collective decision making in which everyone has a say and everyone has an input. Now, that doesn't mean that you're not going to be inconvenienced by the fact that other people have different views to you. There'll be different groups in society who say, I want to spend more money on renewable energy. Others who say, I want to spend more money on, community resources and whatever. You'll have to work that out through a process of deliberation and debate. And ultimately, that democratic process will have to be seen as legitimate. If you don't win, you're going to have to kind of continue to go along with that, even if that does inconvenience you. But that's what democracy is. That's what it means to live in community with other people. It means you don't always get your way. You don't always get to have exactly what you want, right? And, it's the case. It's the same thing today, because most of us never really get what we want. We certainly don't get what we need in capitalist societies. And that isn't just the case when it comes to, the basic resources that we need to survive, which is true for most people. It's also the case for things like a sense of community, a sense of belonging, identity. All of these things have been eroded and undermined by the kind of spread of individualism and neoliberalism that leave us without the basic things that make us human, really. The kind of communities and relationships with each other and with the natural environment that have sustained us as people for a very long time. And, those things come with costs as well. If you want to live in harmony with nature, that requires guardianship and stewardship and care. If you want to live in harmony with other people, That requires working on how you form relationships and how you kind of communicate and interact with other people. So there are always going to be costs to this model, but I would say that the costs of that model are costs that, if you pay them, kind of help you to develop as a person, whereas the costs of this model are ones that, if you pay them, they actually kind of undermine your development as a human being, because it's like you can't afford to eat.
Yeah. There are so many factors that intermesh, isn't there? You can't talk about capitalism without talking about the effect on the environment. You can't talk about consumerism without talking about choice or not choice. I'm sure you've been asked this question before, but I'm just curious about what you think about the Chinese state capitalism system. What's the good, the bad, and the ugly of that?
Yeah, so, what's been incredible about Chinese development is the way that they've really kind of perfected this model of industrial strategy, which is basically governments working with the private sector to innovate and create jobs, but particularly to kind of undertake technological innovation and development, because that's something that poor countries have really struggled with for a very long time. Basically, the rich world controls all of the technology, all of the innovation, all the intellectual property, and rigidly restricts other countries in being able to access that, which is why, it's hard. It was difficult for poor countries to get access to, HIV medication and stuff, because it was developed by monopolistic corporations in the rich world, and they guarded their access to that. It's the same with lots of different forms of kind of productive technology as well. And poor countries need those productive technologies to be able to develop and grow. And what China's done really successfully is basically partner with private sector organizations in both China and the rich world to develop Chinese, technological development, basically to kind of have a domestic form of innovation that draws on innovation that's taken place in other parts of the world, but added to it as well. And that's created kind of astonishing levels of economic growth. It has also led to fascinating new technological developments that we haven't seen in other parts of the world. So, China's progress on renewables, for example, has been astonishing. And they're trialing lots of different new kinds of renewable energies and technologies that could be really, really important in the future. So there's that kind of, they've almost perfected the spirit of capitalism, which for Marx was this kind of spirit of technological progress and constant innovation. He always said that was one of the good things about capitalism, was the way that it was able to kind of embed constant technological innovation, that there was always an incentive to, develop something new and useful, right? The issue is that the Chinese state rigidly limits people's freedoms, and also it's still a capitalist economy, so it still relies on mass exploitation of workers. You still have extremely wealthy and powerful billionaires who work very closely with the state to do, what they want to do. And strikes are put down, protest movements are obviously put down. There's a huge amount of authoritarianism and control. And again, there's a contradiction there and there's a challenge there, which is that the Chinese people put up with this model because they're promised growth, jobs, and increase in living standards. And that's fine for as long as you have growth. But as soon as, and this happens inevitably in a capitalist economy because there's ups and downs to the business cycle, as soon as that growth levels off, and as soon as China can't promise 6, 7, 8% growth per year, then suddenly that model stops being so legitimate and it starts to be challenged a little bit more. So that's going to be the issue that the Chinese state faces moving forward, is, whether or not it can actually continue to marry authoritarianism with really swift capitalist development and technological progress.
What about the way it's organised, though? How does that marry with your concept of social democracy? So, every so often, I don't know how many years it is, but there's this massive meeting, and they tell the next leaders up what they would like to have, and then the leaders up then go and have this meeting, and then they announce what you're going to have for the next 10 years. And it's all very transparent. What they're going to do is transparent. How they get there, I'm not so sure it's transparent. But, you can read their 10-year plan from 10 years ago, and they did pretty much everything else that they said they were going to do. They were going to focus on tech. They were going to do this. And now, they've announced their next 10-year plan. That organisation of bottom-up, apparently, does that fit with how you see how a new order could be established, or is that an illusion?
Yeah, no, it's not what I'm envisioning at all, because it's not really democratic and there's no real accountability. So it's just kind of elites deciding what they think is best for everyone else. And that's kind of the opposite of the model that I envisioned, really, which is people engaging in the decisions that affect their lives.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today. You and your book have given me hope, I have to say, that there may be some way of rescuing our society from the oligarchs. And I do thank you. This is your book again, Vulture, Capitalism. Oh, I can't do this. Corporate Crimes, Backdoor Bailouts and the Death of Freedom. And I heartily recommend it. Now, you apparently will be talking on the 23rd of April at the Post-Capitalist Aotearoa conference in Wellington. And
I'm really excited. It's a shame I can't be there in person, actually. I was hoping to be able to come, but it is rather a long way to travel.
Yeah, we are a different country.
And I had a clash. So I will be speaking over Zoom, and I'm really looking forward to it.
We are a different country, and something you might look into some stage is the treaty that was negotiated between Indigenous Māori in 1840, and how it is actually stopping large corporations coming in here and buying up willy-nilly without consulting Māori. And we've got a kind of little break on the capitalist system, which you might look into at some stage. But
that sounds extremely interesting, and exactly the type of thing that I'm researching when it comes to my next book, which is looking at how we resist this model and highlighting exciting examples of different ways of organizing the economy. So maybe I'll have to come over for my research.
Oh, the treaty is something you need to look into. The ACT Party, which is an extremely right-wing party, wanted to bring in an act that would rewrite the treaty because, frankly, it's getting in the way of big money and big business. And so, we just need to get rid of this thing. Well, there were massive protests. We've had 80,000 submissions. They've had to say, well, look, we can't read all of these submissions, so we'll just get rid of it, shall we? And so,
I think I saw this because there was a young female Maori politician who did the haka in the parliament, wasn't there? Yeah, that was very cool. I like that.
I think you should look into it. Anyway, lovely to meet you, Grace, and thank you so much for talking with me today.
So lovely to meet you too, Brian. Thanks for having me on your show.
Bye. Thank you for listening. For more interviews and public journalism, please visit brianbruce.substack.com. brianbruce.substack.com. Ka kite.